Hello everyone and welcome to the Learning Launchpad, the very first episode of this Acadium podcast in which we'll be exploring all aspects of 21st century lifelong learning. I'm Mark Anderson and I'm joined here today by my co-host James Patterson, biologist and educator. Hello James.
Hello.
Now our topic for our first conversation today is all about this issue of evaluation. So evaluation of education, evaluation of teaching, and we're going to use those terms quite loosely and quite flexibly to describe any sort of designed learning engagement. Okay, so it could be a session, an individual class or a lesson. It could be a lecture perhaps in the higher education context. It could be a whole course. It could be an online course or a webinar or some sort of informal learning engagement perhaps that takes place outside of a formal institution. So we're going to be looking at what we as the educators or the designers, the facilitators of that learning engagement need to think about in terms of measuring the success of the engagement itself. So we're going to be probing that issue in a bit more depth in this episode. So, James, what do you understand, in very general terms, what do you understand evaluation to really be about?
Well, I suppose for me that would be being able to demonstrate that the learners have learned what was the intention for the session. Yeah, that's right. And I think that's probably a common starting point for a lot of educators when they're thinking about evaluation. They're thinking about, what learning has actually taken place. Are the learners able to then go on and pass a test or be successful in an exam? Have they actually learned the content, the material that you set out, that you intended for them to learn? I suppose from a sort of an educational development point of view, there might be some other sort of factors around evaluation that would be quite useful to consider in different situations. So I'm just trying to think of other ways in which other aspects of that learning engagement that could be evaluated, that could be measured in some sort of way. So what that looks like in practice will obviously depend on a lot of different things, not least of all the context of the educational setting, whether it's formal or informal. Then you've got all sorts of the quality assurance requirements and that sort of thing, which is all a sort of a type of evaluation. But I wonder what else could be evaluated as part of that. What are your thoughts? Well, it would depend, I suppose, on what the learning involved. But of course, there's sort of knowledge-based learning, I suppose. But then usually, depending on the course and what level the student's working at, there's other associated skills that will also be learnt. So different forms of assessment, I suppose, will help to ascertain how far the learners have got in regard to those different elements. Yeah,
so sort of a more holistic kind of skill set. That's certainly something that we talk about a lot. I do a lot of work in higher education, and that's preparing learners for the workplace, for employability, for introducing them to a whole range of skills that are perhaps not part of the academic curriculum, so-called co-curricular skills and activities that they're going to need to have acquired to perform effectively in the workplace, or to kind of blend in and be productive, to be comfortable in a workplace situation. So those kinds of things are stuff that we're talking all the time about, bringing those into the learning experience. So I suppose that's one thing that you can look for as part of an evaluation, isn't it? The extent to which they've been able to engage with that wider set of skills successfly.
I also think it's important in terms of the quality of the learning, and it's sort of how likely it is to sort of be maintained or have a sort of long-lasting impact, or be part of their sort of wider learning experience. Because if it's a very sort of superficial way of learning something, and that the benefit of that in the long term would be much less than something with more depth that's going to give the learner something to move forward with.
Yeah.
Especially with associated skills.
Absolutely. So, this is something that, again, we talk about quite a lot in higher education spaces. So this idea of, encouraging learners to take a deep approach to their learning rather than a so-called surface approach or a strategic approach. These are concepts we can explore in more depth in other episodes, perhaps. But certainly this idea that, as part of the learning experience, there should be some element of transformation within the learner, some sort of permanent shift, perhaps, I suppose, if you want to describe it like that, that they then take with them, and that they've changed on some level fundamentally as a result of having gone through that learning experience, and that they then take that with them into the workplace and potentially for the rest of their lives. So, just thinking about the sorts of things that we can ask ourselves, that if you were starting to embrace a kind of a reflective practitioner approach as an educator, which I suppose is something that should really be encouraged, I think, in most contexts, thinking all the time about how you can improve or enhance the experience for learners and the sort of impact that it has on them. Perhaps we can think in terms of sort of two main types of evaluation. So there's much like assessment, when we're assessing what learners have learnt. We talk about formative assessment and summative assessment. Well, the same sort of principles can apply to evaluation. So there's formative types of evaluation, which are all about helping you to understand how you can improve and enhance the learning engagement as it's going on and for future cohorts. And then, of course, there's summative evaluation, which is all about assessing how well something went and making a final sort of judgment. And often that's linked to decisions about whether or not a course should continue, whether or not an individual educator gets a good review or a bad review, and it kind of has implications for career progression in some situations as well.
I suppose there's a different thing to be understood from evaluation of learning and evaluation of teaching or how learning is taking place.
Yeah.
Which is, I suppose, depends what your interest is. But obviously, if you're involved in education development, I suppose it's really the former, isn't it? Is that really what you're talking about?
I think so. I think, because in terms of summative evaluation, it seems to me that that's something you can't really escape from. It's kind of a very top-down, QA kind of driven approach. So we have our sort of end of course evaluations, we have institution staff appraisals and that sort of thing. So I suppose what I'm more interested in maybe is what the individual can do in terms of their own kind of ownership, I suppose, of their learning designs, of their learning engagement, of their own practice, and as I said before, becoming a reflective practitioner. So maybe designing some evaluation strategies and tools of your own that you can kind of apply in addition to those standard kind of unavoidable QA-based evaluation processes.
Evaluation of how well a course has gone, I suppose, can be measured in terms of progress that students have made. And that will obviously vary between cohorts.
Yeah.
But if you can demonstrate that students have progressed, then surely that means everything's going well to some extent. But you might see a variation in that depending on the cohort. And then what works one year or in 1 week might not seem to work the next. But that might not be necessarily a reason to change it.
Oftentimes, a lot of institutions now have sort of online evaluation tools, questionnaires that students fill out when they've completed a course. And there's been some criticism around them in terms of, the kinds of questions that they're asking don't really tend to evaluate whether or not any meaningful learning has taken place. They seem to be very focused on, whether they thought the lecturer was any good or whether they enjoyed the class or the course or the lesson. So very much kind of designed around an educator as service provider kind of perspective. And they tend not to ask the sorts of questions that measure, as you brought up, this idea of learning gain. So, what has actually changed for the learner from where they started a course or a degree perhaps, or even a series of lessons, or even an individual lesson, compared to what they walk away with at the end of it. what has that change been, that learning gain?
Yeah, 'cause I work a lot with sixth form students doing A-levels. And there's been a shift recently in A-levels, certainly in science I can talk about, that the exams have become harder from the student's perspective. And they're back to doing terminal end of 2-year exams, as they did many years ago. And part of the consequence of that is that students find the exams difficult because they are more demanding, and they have to have a better depth of knowledge and be able to synthesize ideas, and they find this more difficult. The exams are more difficult, but they have lowered the sort of grade boundary, so it's not so you don't have to get the highest percentage to get the highest grade. But probably if you surveyed the students, they would be dissatisfied with that experience because they feel like they can't answer all the exam questions, but they're not in the know and realise that they're not expected to be able to answer all the exam questions.
Yeah.
So evaluation from a student's perspective is not always the whole story, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because most people will agree that this change in A-levels is taking students in the right direction in terms of what they're going to do afterwards, in terms of synthesizing ideas, using a broader range of skills, and things like that.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's always tricky when you're talking about this issue of learner satisfaction as being a measurement by which you judge whether or not a course or any sort of learning engagement has been successful or not. So, you could argue that some of the most powerful and useful and valuable learning experiences have been very uncomfortable, and they're deliberately so, because the learning emerges from the challenge, from that discomfort, from kind of bringing learners through a liminal space into sort of uncharted territory. That is intrinsically uncomfortable. So I suppose you could argue that instead of asking a question of how satisfied were you with this particular course, it might be more meaningful to find out about how well supported they felt as they went through a potentially uncomfortable experience.
Well, also, they may feel uncomfortable because the course has been challenging and they've been stretched in several ways. And so the outcome is that they have a probably higher order set of skills, but they may feel like they're not in full command of them, or they haven't achieved as much as they would like, but they probably have been taken further than maybe the course did before it was redesigned to challenge them rather than to satisfy their to feel comfortable.
Yeah, but I know that some organisations, for example, a national lifelong learning organisation that I did some teaching for, they have quite a clever evaluation system whereby learners are given an evaluation form at the very beginning of a class before the course really kicks off, and they're asked to describe sort of how they feel in terms of competence or level of comfort with a certain number of defined elements of the subject that they're going to be engaging with. And at the end of the course, they're asked to revisit those forms and give a judgment as to how far improved they think they are now at the end of the course compared to where they were when they started. So that's a really kind of very personal measure of learning gain. Importantly, how the learner feels that they have moved from before to afterwards. And from an educator's point of view, that I think is much more valuable insight than just were you satisfied with this course? How good was the teacher? How engaging was the teacher? Which I think is a bit more problematic. So in terms of designing an evaluation strategy, the sort of things that I tend to look out for or to find information about are things like were my intended learning outcomes relevant and appropriate, and were they pitched at the right level? So that's something that when you're initially designing a course, you do what you can to kind of pitch learning outcomes at the right level for your particular cohort. But, nothing beats the value of hindsight when you can look back and see how learners actually got on with the outcomes that you defined for them. Thinking about learning and teaching activities, were they effective, and importantly, were they inclusive? Was everybody able to engage with all of the activities that you designed as part of that learning engagement?
Well, that's another issue, isn't it? I mean, because often there should be some form of differentiation at all levels. So, were all students able to do something? Perhaps that shouldn't be the case. No,
but I mean, in terms of, was there enough variety in the types of learning activities so that all learners could engage on some level on their own terms? So if all of your learning activities are a particular kind, a particular type of activity, without any variety, then it's likely that there'll be some students that are less able to engage with those. And you've kind of given an advantage to those that...
Yeah.
So, I mean, inclusive learning and teaching is something that we'll be discussing in more depth in a future episode. But, I mean, there's all sorts of interesting things that you can ask as you're designing an evaluation strategy, and different sources of information about those things as well. So just thinking about sources of data, where can we get data from, James, when we're asking ourselves these sorts of questions, do you think? I mean, in your context, in your experience, where do you look? What sort of information are you looking for to tell you about the success of your learning engagement? I mean, you've already mentioned the actual academic outcomes for students.
Well, I think that's the main. I mean, apart from other forms of feedback from students, comparisons with similar courses run by different institutions.
Yeah, that's a good one. In lifelong learning, there's a lot of talk about this idea of peer observation. So that's something that we always try and encourage. So getting your colleagues, fellow teachers, fellow educators to take part in or observe you doing what you do.
Oh, well, that's, yeah.
As a source of data, a source of evidence for evaluating the success.
I mean, that happens a lot more in secondary schools, I would suspect, than universities. Probably the least often, maybe in some forms of lifelong learning.
Yeah. Well, it's something that they're really trying to push forward now as part of professional development. It's something that they're really trying to encourage. So rather than, or as well as, have an educational developer or some senior person in the organisation observe you.
There are endless forums for exchange of practice and ideas amongst, I would say, school teachers.
Absolutely.
Probably very minimal, I should think, in higher education, that sort of exchange.
Well, I mean, it varies from institution to institution. I mean, there are institutions that are perhaps more focused on teaching and learning than others that might be more research focused. So some institutions are quite innovative and very engaged with developing sort of peer support networks and sharing of best practice and things between teachers. But it's a very uneven landscape. In terms of getting feedback from students, so this is sorts of feedback that go above and beyond the standard kind of satisfaction questionnaires at the end of a course. Of course, you can still use questionnaires and surveys, but perhaps by putting in some questions that you want the answers to, questions that tap into a greater depth of information. Of course, there's always a possibility to arrange little focus groups and even interviews with students to get a more in-depth, more qualitative insight into how they felt about an experience and what it meant for them as an individual.
Certainly that all helps to evaluate the student experience and could be used to feedback into development of the course. But I think there are other ways to develop the course beyond just looking at student feedback.
Sure.
Because students are not experts in education, so they can only sort of suggest things which might be actually be quite good. I mean, some of the things they might suggest to improve the course because they are exposed maybe to other learning environments that the particular facilitator that's on the course that they've been on are not aware of. Yeah. So interesting things can come from students, but ultimately, I suppose, development of a course in the face of evaluation should considering other things as well.
Yeah, excellent. I think that's a really good point. So that brings up this whole issue of triangulation of data. So rather than just relying on one particular source, like the student's satisfaction level, let's say, or the student's opinions about a course, like you said, students don't always know what the ingredients of a high quality learning experience are. They can talk certainly about their experience, but if you can triangulate that source of data with other data, so I mean that could be, as we talked about, peer feedback, your own education peers. It could be triangulated with your own self-evaluation and reflection, or it could be coming from those academic outcomes as well. So it's a good idea to draw from multiple sources of data as part of this evaluation process.
I mean, having said that students are not experts in education, they do actually become reasonably good at it because they get exposed to, and as they mature, they become more discerning, and they can feel if something is working and how useful it will be for their learning. They can be quite discerning eventually.
Absolutely. Yeah, so, looking for opportunities, I suppose, to enable students, learners to get more involved in the design of their own learning experiences. And that's part of a kind of ongoing formative evaluation process, isn't it? You're observing what's going on, you're a reflective practitioner, so you're thinking about how that went, whether there are any opportunities that you missed for creating perhaps more interactivity or more engagement and so on. But the important thing is to be thinking about these things. So if you're not even thinking about them and you're just going through the motions, you're very focused on the content, the syllabus that you've got to deliver, you're not thinking about, is this going well? How is this working? How are my students engaging? Then I think that can potentially be a real missed opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, because there's quite an expectation in secondary schools for learning to be happening in each session.
Yeah.
And you should be able to demonstrate that. Not at the end of it or throughout the session. Actually, that you should be monitoring the learning, and I think that should be more widespread. That if people can monitor the assessment more precisely throughout the course, that level of detail could be an important part of the evaluation as well. Not just the for sort of summative or formative assessments. There should be a continuous form of formative assessment throughout, and that can be difficult to record to produce the data. I think you were getting at, but it could be recorded.
Yeah, I think even if it's recorded informally as part of your self-reflective practice as a teacher, and I think what you've raised there is an important point in regards to the type of learning activity that goes on in a session, in a lecture, in a workshop, in a classroom. There are certain types of learning activity that lend themselves more readily to that kind of continuous formative assessing and evaluation than others. So
I think you made an interesting point there in terms of the reflection. I think that often is the best place for these sort of things I'm talking about. So, for example, if something doesn't go well, this may not come through in any form of evaluation, but a facilitator should make a note of that. And, lots of people didn't understand this activity, or be honest about that, because it's their course, they're teaching, and they'll forget it. And then next time they do it, oh no, I forgot last time this didn't work, and it's happening again. So I think definitely there has to be some close attention to reflection and feeding into evaluation.
Definitely. And sometimes I actually use like a self-evaluation form that I designed for myself, drawing from a lot of influences in the education world, that is just kind of a helpful crib sheet, I suppose, that enables me to structure my reflective process. So after a session or after a course, I'll get out this sheet and it'll prompt me for particular things. So I think there's one section called what seemed to work well, and I can list of things that I thought what worked really well. So I definitely want to do those things again. What didn't work as well as I'd planned. So, I start to think about, well, why didn't that work? And what could I change or do differently to help that to happen? And then there's another box that says, next time I teach this session, I will try. What will I try? Will I take something out? Will I change something? Will I add something? And then, of course, a free space to ruminate on any other kind of reflective aspects of what happened. So it's just kind of like really harnessing those reflective notes and channeling them into an action plan for how you're going to take that forward and improve either that same class when we teach it again, or your next class with the same cohort, or a future cohort, whatever it might be.
Well, I suppose it could be part of a whole sort of development plan for a course after evaluation. Could be taken into consideration for further development for when the course runs again.
Absolutely. Well, lots to think about. This is a huge topic, educational evaluation. But for everybody listening, please, we'd love to hear your thoughts and comments. What practices do you employ to evaluate your own teaching, your own learning engagements, curriculum designs, and so on? We'd really love to hear all about that and get some of your feedback on this episode. Please stick with us for the future. We've got another exciting episode coming up next week. But for now, I guess our takeaway point for this episode is that one of the best things you can do is to be constantly evaluating, to have that internal compass that's always looking for ways to improve things. So asking yourself, are your teaching sessions interactive? Are there opportunities for dialogue, group work where appropriate? In those kinds of scenarios, you just get more opportunity to glimpse the level of success that you're having in that session, in that moment. So those kinds of active learning strategies, and we'll be talking about these in a future episode again, certainly, as we've said, lend themselves to more thoughtful and insightful evaluation. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'm Mark Anderson here with James Patterson for Acadium, and this very first historic episode of the Learning Launchpad podcast.